let me just ask you, do you think America is inching closer to a second civil war?
It is a perfectly reasonable question. It's a question I think a lot of people are asking themselves now. Um, I don't think if there is to be a civil war, I don't think it's going to look anything like the civil war that occurred in the 1860s. I really don't. Um, Obviously, we're a long period past that. But why do I say that? Well, I think that what it's harder to group people by section in the same way, right? You look at a map of politics in the last political election or the political election before that, and we talk about red states, blue states, and it looks like, oh, gee, look, there's a sectional divide. But it's very deceptive, as I'm sure you know, because pick one of those states, right, that's red, and it turns out, well, they're only red by a couple percentage points. Pick a state that's blue, and it just by a few points could have gone the other way. So the map that we have in our head, that electoral map, if you will, from whether it's 2024 or 2020, is deceptive in that way because we look at that and then we look at the map of the Civil War, which is a sectional map where we say, oh, those states were with the Confederacy, those states were with the Union. Oh dear, look at us now. It kind of looks like then. But it doesn't. It just isn't. There's absolute division and polarization. I don't deny that, but it doesn't map neatly onto sections the way that and that's going to just in a territorial way. It's going to make it basically impossible to have a war that looks like that war did.
Hi, everyone. This is AJ Woodhams, host of the War Books podcast, where I interview today's best authors writing about war-related topics. Today, I am extremely excited to have on the show Michael Vorenberg for his new book, Lincoln's Peace, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Michael Vorenberg is a professor of history at Brown University. He is the author of Final Freedom, The Civil War, The Abolition of Slavery, and the 13th Amendment, which was a finalist for the Lincoln Prize and a key source for Steven Spielberg's 2012 film Lincoln, which I loved. He is also the author of the Emancipation Proclamation, A Brief History with Documents, as well as a number of essays on slavery, emancipation, and the U.S. Constitution. His writings have appeared in the Chicago Tribune, the New York Times, Politico, and the Washington Post. Mike, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, AJ. How are you?
I'm I'm excellent. Thanks for joining me. Like a lot of other Americans, the Civil War was my first love. I feel like with war literature and learning about war, and here in America, we all grow up learning about all these battles and these names and these people, for better or for worse. Which we might get into some of these names later. We will get into some of these names later in the show. But always good to have somebody talking about the Civil War on, let alone a distinguished scholar like yourself.
Well, thank you for having me on, and I really appreciate it. And happy to talk about the book and about the Civil War and about whatever else we end up leading into, which I'm sure will probably stray a little bit from the Civil War, which is also good.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, hopefully. I have a lot of questions. Hopefully, we'll get to them. But first, question I like to start off with asking everybody is: you could just tell us, what is your book about?
The book is about the many endings of the Civil War. And if you notice, I use the word plural, endings, as opposed to a single ending. And maybe it's best if I explain how I got into this book. I, like many people, grew up as an American school kid. I read history textbooks that always talked about the Civil War and had the end of the war. And there's almost always an image there of Lee surrendering to Grant at Appomattox. And that's the end of the war. And it's a visual ending. It's a very visual ending. It's a picture. You mentioned Spielberg's 2012 film, Lincoln. There's a scene in that film, it's one of the few where Lincoln isn't in it, where Lee surrenders to Grant. So it's such an important and such a memorable, iconic moment in American history. It's sort of irresistible. And it was irresistible, I think, for Spielberg when he made the film. I was doing research on a different book at the National Archives. And I called up a box, and the wrong box came. That's sort of how this begins. And the wrong box turned out to be a box. It was the letter E instead of the letter C. I had nothing to do while waiting for the right box, so I started going through the box, and there's this topic in the box that says "End of Civil War," and it's a thick file. And I thought, how could that possibly be a topic and a thick file? We all know that the war ended right at Appomattox with this great surrender. And so I started going through it. And what it was is a assistant secretary of war in the 1890s had written this massive report because he had been tasked to find what is actually the actual ending, the legal ending. This was important for a number of legalistic reasons, like what kind of a pension do we pay and some other things. And in this report was just an incredible assortment of facts that I knew some, I didn't know many. And put all together, they told a story of a war that begins to end at Appomattox, but only begins to end. And then has a series of other endings that turn out to be false endings, restarts, other endings, and finally a declaration by a president, President Johnson, that the war is over, as if you can sort of declare war to be non existent, even if the fighting continues. Seeing all this laid out for me, the kernel of this idea for a book was seeded in my brain. Although I didn't get around to actually taking it on as a book for about 5 or so years. And that's what this book is about. It's about really the ways in which there are these multiple endings and why that matters, why it matters, how we think about the when of the ending of the Civil War and why it matters, and then why the when necessarily ties into the where, because they both get into these issues of what is the Civil War? How do you define it by time, beginning, end? How do you define it by place? Is it all in Virginia in the East? No, it's in other places too. And it involves places in the far West. It involves the borderlands of Mexico. It involves the ocean. So these are all things I had to grapple with in the book, and I grapple with in the book as I try to find the ending or endings of the American Civil War.
Well, if somebody, now I know this is a question that you basically say is unanswerable, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Somebody comes up to you and says, Professor Vorenberg, what date did the U.S. Civil War end? What answer would you give?
Yeah. April 9, 1865 is the surrender of Robert E. Lee to Ulysses Grant. And I would say that's the end of the war, but it's complicated, which is the classic, right, historian thing to say. And it's complicated. And then I would hope that the person who asked me the question would say, what do you mean it's complicated? And then I would give an answer sort of like I just gave to you about what the book is about, right? Uh, but one of the parts of the answer that I really would say, I'm being a little bit flippant, but truthfully, I would say to the person, if you must have an end date, this is a very good end date, Appomattox. Um, but then I would say, why must you have an end date? Why is it that any person, regardless of whether they're a historian or not, maybe it's not a US war, maybe it's another war, why might there be this yearning to have in their mind a discernible moment or day or place where the war ends, right? And Appomattox, of course, serves that kind of function perfectly. And I'm okay with that. I'm fine with that. I've written this book that explains why Appomattox isn't really the ending, but I have to tell you, I teach the Civil War and Reconstruction, and I'm going to continue, because I can't help myself, to use words like post Appomattox or after Appomattox as a shorthand for after the war. Um, so, yes, that's the end date I would give. And then I would say, but it's also not the end date. And I know that's terribly frustrating, but
No,
that's the way I operate.
but it is so interesting because, like you just said, like it's a very kind of like I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, but in some sense, it's convenient to say that the surrender at Appomattox was the end of the U.S. Civil War, especially when it's, I'm thinking about like in the context of like teaching an American school teaching the Civil War to American children. And it is kind of this like this, it has a feeling of this like struggle of good over evil. And then evil was vanquished on this day at this time. And it kind of buttons up very neatly. But it's very problematic,
I'm
as
not
you,
sure that you grew up in Southern Alabama that you'd have the same that you'd
you
have
know
the
what?
same
You're right.
interpretation.
Let me correct my let me add some context. I grew up in Indiana, northern Indiana,
Yeah.
where this was the history taught to me.
Okay.
But you're right. I forget that there is a whole part of this country that learned a different history.
Yeah.
Um, but I mean, well, talk about that. Like, what would you say, like from the Southern perspective? Would a Southerner say that like the clean end date would be the surrender at Appomattox?
I think they would. I do think they would. They might not be happy about it, and they might see it as a problematic ending, because how do you reconcile the hero Robert E. Lee, who is still, of course, one of the greatest heroes of the Confederacy and of Confederate memory, and therefore of Southern white memory? How do you reconcile a hero surrendering? Well, there are ways to do that, of course, and very much the best way to do that is through what we call the lost cause narrative, and to say in his surrender he was being noble, right? He recognized that the war could not be won, and this was the noble way to end it. So, but that doesn't mean they're happy about it, but they then recognize it as an ending, as a kind of necessary ending, and they tie it. I'm not saying the they in this question is a sort of amorphous they, and I'm thinking about lost cause movements, maybe today, but even more so 100 years ago or so. So that's how often they would do it, but they would still, I think, locate it in Appomattox. Yeah, and of course today you might find people saying, "Oh no, the war is not over." Uh, and when I was working on the book and say I would be asked, "What are you working on?" I'm working on a book about the end of the Civil War, and somebody might say, "Oh, did it end? Is it over?" And they were joking, of course, and it did end. I mean, it really did have an ending. It's hard to find the ending. Yes, there are struggles today. There's polarization. They're not entirely sectional. It's not all north south, that's for sure. Whatever polarization today is not the same war. But yeah, that war is over. And I think actually a lot of people are still going to point to Appomattox. And something earlier you said about how history teachers teach. I don't fault them for this. I taught middle school history a bit before I went to graduate school and high school history. One of the reasons why history is such a great subject is we have an expectation of stories. What do we expect of stories, right? We expect stories to have a beginning, middle, and end. Not all do, but we expect that. And so certain episodes in history, like a war, we expect to have a narrative structure, beginning, middle, and end. And so it's perfectly natural. And then we force our students, unfortunately, to learn these dates. What is the start date, the end date, right? And then those dates stick. And so that's just been the way history has been taught for a long time.
Well, well, I want to towards the end of this conversation, I want to come back to how things are taught. But I want to start off before we get too carried away with those types of conversations with just a little bit of history and some context for our listeners out there. Could you just give us like briefly the lead up to Lee's surrender at Appomattox? What was going on at the time? Some of the events that led up to that surrender, and just situate us in the history of this time period where your book is taking place.
Sure. I will. I'll give an overview, but I'll I'm going to have to leave some things out,
Of course.
and I'll explain what I mean as I
Yeah.
give the overview. So let me return us to the spring of 1865, and in the spring of 1865, the war has been going on for 4 years, and at that moment in the spring of 1865, things are not going well for the Confederacy. There has been a sustained siege, I'll call it, on two key places in Virginia that are key for the Confederacy. One is the Confederate capital of Richmond, and equally, if not more important, is the city of Petersburg, Virginia, which is the railroad hub and therefore the sort of key supply spot. And Petersburg has been under siege for a very long time, with a number of attacks that have been repelled and so forth. It becomes clear to Ulysses Grant, who's the lieutenant general in command of the U.S. Army of Armed Forces, that it seems that the Confederacy may be close to falling. That is to say, that these two cities are close to falling. Grant's headquarters are in City Point, Virginia, which is on the coast, downriver from the James, from Richmond. And he sends word to Lincoln that maybe you would like to visit. And there's sort of an unspoken understanding that if Lincoln visits, he might actually get to see these cities fall. Lincoln takes Grant up on the invitation. He leaves Washington, D.C. It'll be the longest time that Lincoln ever leaves Washington, D.C. He's gone for 2 weeks, and he goes to City Point. And I argue in the beginning of the book that he goes believing that he's going to witness the end of the war, and he's actually going to orchestrate some kind of template, if you will, of how things will work going forward to make the peace. So Lincoln's on the scene in City Point. And he is there in late March, and he's meeting with Grant. He meets with Sherman. They actually all meet together. And then he has a few other meetings with Grant. Richmond falls on April 3rd. So this is just a few days after Lincoln shows up. And when Richmond falls, that's obviously a turning point. That's the capital. Jefferson Davis, just before the Union troops come in, he and the Confederate cabinet get on a rail car and head into the interior of Virginia. And Davis refuses to suggest that the Confederate government is gone. He says the Confederacy continues to exist. The government's on a rail car, and the Confederacy is still doing just fine. In fact, it's better than ever because now the Army doesn't have to waste its time defending Richmond. And so the Army can just focus on combating U.S. troops. Petersburg also falls. And so Lincoln will actually end up touring the battleground of Petersburg and tour Richmond. All right, where's Robert Lee in all of this? So Lee's main activity has been to defend Richmond and Petersburg. Now they're gone. So Lee starts to march west from Richmond. If I had a map, it might be easier, but try to imagine Richmond and now just go due west. And you're following the Appomattox River upriver toward the mountains of Appalachia, the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia. And what Lee's plan is to get his troops into the mountains. And if he can do that, maybe he can somehow join up with an even bigger army, which is Joe Johnston's army in North Carolina. You may ask me about that army as well. Okay. In the marching eastward, Lee's army, or elements of Lee's army, has a series of engagements with U.S. troops. So that's the history I'm not going to talk about now. That's a military history of a series of battles and skirmishes that Lee's having to fight, as he's moving his troops. It's not a retreat, right? It's a motion with a rear end action going on with his forces. However, when he gets to the site of Appomattox Courthouse, that's the name of the town. It's the full name is Appomattox Courthouse. For a variety of reasons, he gets boxed in by the U.S. troops, and it doesn't look like he's going to make it to the mountains. There's one last push to try to break through the lines. It fails, and that's when Lee starts sending messages to Grant saying, "Can we meet?" And so there's this kind of preface to the surrender, and then they meet on April 9, 1865, in Wilmer McLean's house in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia.
Really, for and I guess I always knew this, but it struck me in your book. Lincoln, but the time between when Robert E. Lee surrenders and Lincoln's assassination is only like a week,
Yeah,
10 days, maybe. Yeah. So, the book is Lincoln. The title of the book is Lincoln's Peace. Um, talk about why this is Lincoln's Peace when, he really only had several days after Lee even surrendered to get this piece together.
yeah. Let me first take us through that chronology a little bit, right?
Sure.
So I mentioned that Lee surrenders on April 9th, but I also mentioned that Lincoln was near the scene before then and that he toured Richmond, for example. So that happens on April 4th. Okay, so between April 4th and April 8th, which is, as you say, a very short time, but it's 5 days. What is Lincoln doing during this period? And he's doing a lot of things. He's talking to commanders, but he's also talking to Virginia civilians, including a lot of leaders. And he's having conversations to inform himself about what might happen next in terms of peace. Among other conversations, he speaks to a couple leaders about the possibility of Virginia convening its legislature as it is, which is a Confederate legislature, and having that legislature declare a reversal, if you will. That is to declare themselves no longer seceded, that they've rejected the Confederacy, and that they're Unionists. That's an example of what Lincoln is playing with. He doesn't necessarily have a plan. It's like so many other things Lincoln does. He's experimenting with different kinds of things and trying to figure out where to land on an actual plan. And I just gave that example of the Virginia legislature, partly because that ends up being a bad move. That ends up being rejected by his cabinet, who says, no, you can't really go that direction. Not the whole cabinet, but the key players, William Henry Seward and Secretary of State, and especially Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War. Okay. Lincoln, uh, for various reasons, leaves Virginia uh, on April 8th. And he arrives in Washington, D.C., and only upon arriving on April 9th does he start to catch wind that there's been this surrender where he just left. Okay, so now there's a surrender. He missed it, right? He left Virginia too early. And so now, as you say, he's not going to be alive much longer. We know that. He doesn't know that. But so he, on April 9th, he gives a quick impromptu speech about Lee's surrender. And then he gives a speech which becomes his last speech. He doesn't know it's his last speech a few days later. But that's a much more sustained and planned speech. But even in that speech, he says, I'll speak more later about what is to come, right? And so whatever Lincoln's peace was to be, it was in the process of forming in his own head and in practice. And then, of course, he's assassinated. So the title, Lincoln's Peace, is a bit of a deceit by me because, first of all, as you say, he dies before there's peace. Second, I don't think he has a very clear sense of what peace looked like. He has very strong ideas about certain things, and a lot of those ideas come out in his final speech. But one last thing I'll say is that in those two speeches I mentioned, the impromptu one he gives after the surrender, he learns about the surrender, and a crowd of celebratory people come to the White House, and he comes and gives an impromptu speech. And then the speech he gives, that's a real address later, he never says the war is over. He doesn't speak those words. He never gives any kind of declaration, proclamation that the war is over. He acknowledges that this is a momentous event, the surrender of Lee, and he congratulates the troops. But he knows very well that there are Confederate troops still in the field, that there are Confederate legislatures of states still active, that there's a massive territory under Confederate control. And so he never declares the war over. So even that most basic idea of something you might think a president would do, he understands very well that this is going to be a process. And he fully expects to be the leader of the process. And he's going to figure out as he goes exactly what that process is. And so, of course, it's all cut short.
Yeah, and it should be noted too that after the years after Appomattox, for a year or two, things weren't exactly peaceful. You point out there is a lot of conflict still going on, still raging. One thing that is very famously known about Lincoln is malice towards none. This kind of bloodless peace that he envisioned. Why was he so committed to that? Why was he so committed to not wanting to punish a lot of the rebels? But also, too, I'm curious, the people around him in your book. It actually sounds like there were a lot of people around him who weren't on board with that, who really did want retribution. Talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Uh, and had Lincoln lived, I think that tension between his view and the views of others may have been something that would have been visible. And I really don't know exactly how it would have been resolved. But to go back, you mentioned with malice toward none. That's a phrase that's the last phrase, really, of the second inaugural that he gives in March. And so that's on March 4th. And again, he doesn't know that the wars that Lee's going to surrender, that these endpoints are coming, but he knows that they could be coming, and he's got that on the mind when he says it. Why? Well, he is very worried, as many people are worried, about how to end a war. That even if the major armies surrender, right? What then is going to happen? And you've got at least two different types of problems, really three. One problem is Confederates who don't want to surrender, even if the leaders do. And a second problem is Northerners who are vengeful, understandably vengeful, and who may act in an aggressive manner to their foes. After all, they blame Northerners, the South, for the war, and vengeance, therefore, can be expected by those who blame them. Part of the second inaugural is talking about who is responsible for the war and trying to defuse those Northerners who hold the South fully responsible, and to say, in many ways, we're all responsible because of the institution of slavery that we allowed to thrive. And that brings me to the third point, which is that Lincoln firmly believes that slavery must be destroyed. He has helped make sure that the resolution for the 13th Amendment, what becomes the 13th Amendment, has gotten through Congress, but it's out to the states for ratification. It is not ratified by the time he's dead. But he also knows that eradicating slavery, it's going to take more than just an amendment to the Constitution. It's going to take force. And so this too is going to take force in conjunction with negotiation, right? That it's going to, and this is his skill, is negotiation. Negotiating with former Confederates, with white people, so that they can play a hand and play a role in emancipation, and also working with African Americans to make sure that they are integrated into the body politic as they should be, knowing that simply declaring slavery over or having an amendment that does that is not enough. He knows these things. They take work, they take patience, they take strategy. And vengeful actions can delay those things, he believes. He's worried about vengeful actions that can delay that, because then you get a recalcitrant or a Southern white population that isn't willing to work with you. And so he's worried about that. And I think those are all factors as to why he does this. But as to others, as you mentioned, who are more vengeful, yes, they exist. And I think it's really important to remember that when Lincoln is assassinated, the spirit of vengeance never has been stronger. Whatever vengeful feelings people had, now they're increased tenfold because of the assassination of Lincoln, which, yes, it's done by a lone assassin, but not really. It's a conspiracy. It really is a conspiracy of a number of people. And people actually assume, naturally, that the Confederacy is behind it. Maybe Jeff Davis himself is behind it. Jeff Davis wasn't behind it, But it's one more reason for these people to despise the Confederates, and it's going to stand in the way. And so then you get someone like Secretary of War Stanton, um, and the Judge Advocate General, Joseph Holt, who's working hand in hand with Stanton. They are pursuing the assassins. They are absolutely convinced that this is a deeper plot that involves many Confederates, and they're going to root it out, and they're going to take vengeance on these people. And Lincoln's successor is Andrew Johnson, who comes in and early on is saying that there will be vengeance against them, that traitors will be punished. And people like Stanton uh, and others who are vengeful, they think Andrew Johnson is their guy. They think he's he's the president they want much more than Lincoln at that moment, right?
At
Because
that
he's
moment,
going to
yeah.
be vengeful. I mean, there's a horrific irony in this that of course Johnson turns out to be not just magnanimous, but idiotically uh, magnanimous in terms of giving power so quickly and easily back to former Confederates. And of course, he turns out to be so deeply racist and have nothing invested at all in the idea of black people being integrated into the American body politic.
I do want to, you might hate this as a historian, but I do want to play some alternate history, perhaps. Let's say that the thinking for Lincoln and the Union leadership was that all of the Confederate leaders should be executed, and that they did maybe execute Jefferson Davis, or I don't know, maybe too complicated to throw in generals and military leaders like Robert E. Lee. But let's say there was just like a large scale execution of all these Confederate leaders. How do you think that would have affected things, in your opinion?
It's hard to say. I think if there was a large scale execution of these people, that memory of that would never have gone away. Uh, Here, I thought about that question a lot, and other historians have thought about it a lot. And it's a really great question. Yeah, it's counterfactual to say, well, let's talk about what happens, but I still think it's extremely relevant. And of course, it's not counterfactual when you ask the question of other wars. When you look at other wars and you see, let's say, the end of World War II, and you can rather easily look at photographs of perpetrators, as they would be called, right, being hanged in Italy, in Germany, right? You have Nuremberg trials, but they often lead to hangings. Although I will say, right, those are also teachable lessons, right? Because there wasn't widespread execution of the highest of all the highest leaders. They were very delicate, right, in the trial of the perpetrator. People were hanged, but they were very cognizant of the possible consequences. So if there was widespread hanging of Jeff Davis and the Confederate cabinet, yeah, I think there would have been deeply entrenched hatred on all sides. And so I don't think it would not have led to much good. I, I don't think it was going to happen. Let us remember that Jefferson Davis was actually captured. That's also part of the book. So he wasn't captured for about a month after Appomattox. He's on the run, and that's part of the book. And it's one of the great stories of the capture of Jefferson Davis. I won't go into too much detail, but he's captured on May 10th, and so they've got him, right. So they've got him, and they've got him in prison finally at Fort Monroe in Virginia, and now, right, the opportunity is there to hang him. And I just told you that Andrew Johnson has said, punishment to traitors, and other people are saying traitors. It turns out that actually getting a process to put Davis on trial and to hang him the way that these people want to is incredibly difficult. It's politically a disaster to do so. And they recognize it right away. So, um, to your counterfactual, I would say to you, AJ, well, tell me what that looks like, right? Oh, does that look like just rounding up people and hanging them? Or would you, AJ, would you like to see some trials first, right? I hope that you might say, well, I'd like there to be some trials. Uh, Well, are they going to be real trials or are they just going to be show trials? Well, there should be some kind of reality to them, right? And so once you have real trials, then you've got a problem. among other things, what's going to happen? Here's what's going to happen. Jefferson Davis is going to get on the stand and say why secession is legal and why all he did was lead a nation in an absolutely legal move to secede. And what's going to happen is a courtroom battle over the legality of secession. Do you want that to happen in 1865 when the war is supposed to be over and people are supposed to be going home and like the thing was supposed to be decided by war and now we're going to fight it out in court? This is a huge problem. And so I say back to you, AJ, what do you envision in terms of these hangings? Because it's not so easy, right? To just hang. It is, easy in the mind to envision people hanging, but the question is, how do you get them from the moment of capture to their head in the noose?
Yeah.
And it's actually in America, we like to think of ourselves as a nation of laws, right? Not of men, as they say. So if law is required to get that person into the noose, it's going to be pretty tough.
Yeah, it's you're absolutely right, and it's much easier to say, and it was much easier to say to just hang people. Hang Jeff Davis was like, as you point out, was a very popular slogan for quite a while. But that actually means that that's a very kind of complicated, um, nasty, long, ripping the Band-Aid off type process. So you're right, like it is very complicated. But then too, as you alluded to, there is, maybe there's a sense of lost justice, perhaps, especially when you think about slavery and the evils of slavery. Um, let's talk about slavery in African Americans towards the end of the war, because I thought you had a lot of really interesting things to say about African American volunteers in the army, which I was surprised to read about. But let's talk about slavery. So after the surrender at Appomattox, you point out several times, it's hard to know when slavery actually really ended, much like it's hard to know when the war ended. But what is I guess the institution of slavery at the surrender at Appomattox? What's that like, and how does that get navigated in the coming years?
Sure. So at the moment of Appomattox in April 9, 1865, the 13th Amendment has passed Congress and is headed to the states for ratification. A number of states have ratified it, but it won't be ratified till December. And actually, there are states, including some northern states, that have voted against it or have refused to vote for it. And then there's the whole question of whether if and how the southern states get to vote for it or not. But that's all legal. That's all a legal question, right? Meanwhile, on the ground, what's been happening for many years is that African Americans have been becoming free, and they've been becoming free through their own actions, leaving plantations or wherever, joining Unionist armies, or simply creating their own lives in various places. And there's been the Emancipation Proclamation, which came in 1863 and basically said wherever the army goes, that place now is a place where slavery doesn't exist. It exempts a few places, but that's effectively what the war is. And I guess I'll say, lastly, Lincoln has made it very clear, well before Appomattox, he has said that the end of the war must include a renunciation of slavery as an institution by all the southern states and by all former slave owners, slave masters, right? So that's part of it. That's a key piece of the 1864 presidential election that Lincoln sticks by. And in his very last speech, he says that he hopes for a righteous and speedy peace. The speedy peace we get, right? What does he mean by righteous? There's no question he means emancipation, right? He means a righteous peace, a peace where the causes that have been fought for, which are not just union, but also the end of slavery, are achieved. Um, so, what's the state of slavery? It's in the process of being eradicated as an institution, which requires law, and it also requires force. And it's the force piece that's really challenging. And that's what's been going on. Armies have been involved in the eradication, and many of these armies include black regiments. So they have been part of this process of making sure that masters uh, declare their slaves free and then abide by the dictates of freedom. And this is what's going on in the summer of 1865 into the fall and beyond. The U.S. Army is still, it's the regular army, but also still has a large number of volunteers, although they're mustering out at a very fast rate. These armed troops are in the South, and the main thing they're doing in the South is they're going around and making sure that emancipation is carried out. The holiday that's celebrated is Juneteenth, and we're coming up on that in June, this coming June, June 19th. That is a moment that acknowledges that move, because what happens on June 19th, 1865 is that a Union general, a US general, comes into Galveston, Texas, reads the Emancipation Proclamation, gives his own proclamation declaring people free. That's all well and good, but then you need troops on the ground in Texas, just if I could focus on Texas here, to make sure that slavery is eradicated in Texas. Declaration isn't enough. That's going to take years. It's going to take years before the practice of enslavement of black people is eradicated. And
And you do
after,
talk about how there is
yeah,
there still is enslavement going on in Texas, after
oh, absolutely.
yes, and if not legally, in practice, it's still
Absolutely. I
happening.
mean,
Yeah.
Texas is a massive state, and the interior of Texas, slavery is still going on. And it's going on with both sides knowing that it's legally over, right? So the master and the former enslaved person know that slavery is over. But if there's no army, right, if there's no force there to make it happen, what then is going to happen? You need legal officials and you need armies. And so the black troops that are there in Texas, they're involved in this process among white troops as well. On the other hand, many of the black troops, and I think you were sort of hinting at this as you mentioned black troops in Texas, um, they also, of course, like many troops, they're ready to go home. They've heard that the war is over, and they enlisted to fight the war, and now the war is over. They assume not only that the war is over, but that emancipation is achieved and that they are free, and not just free, mind you, but they are full American citizens. Therefore, it's with great surprise that they learn, many of these black soldiers, a couple things. One, they can't go home, that they're still under contract to serve because their service contract said that they have to serve either for 3 years or till the end of the war. And the 3 years are not up. And though uh, Appomattox has occurred, the War Department says, oh, guess what? The war actually isn't over for your purposes. Um, and second, not only do they have to continue serving, but when the time does come to muster out, this is a very revealing moment in Texas. Soldiers, when they muster out from the United States Army, are allowed to purchase their service weapons, and they are able to do so, and it's generally a good deal that you get if you purchase your service weapon. Um, the order goes out that in Texas, the black U.S. troops are not allowed to purchase, who are mustering out, are not allowed to purchase their service weapons, but the white ones can. And this is, the reason given is that the white civilians, the Southern white civilians, are very worried about black armed men in their communities, and that certainly is a big reason. But I would say that fear extends well beyond the white civilians of the South, of Texas, to other white civilians of the South, and I would say it extends to the North as well. That there is this concern, deep concern, about what happens to armed black men when they muster out. There's no reason for this concern. The real concern, of course, is what is the armed white Southern civilians. They turn out to be, of course, the problem. But this tells us so much about the fragility of emancipation on the ground, right? And how it actually is going to take work to make it happen. A larger topic I'll just mention is that when we ask ourselves to think about when slavery ends, That's a very broad question. We might think about Juneteenth. We might think about the ratification of the 13th Amendment. We might say, oh, it doesn't really, we might think about the modern civil rights movement, whatever. But if we think about Juneteenth or the ratification of the 13th Amendment, I'll just point out that those events are typically taught as things that happen outside of the Civil War. They're not Civil War events, right? But in fact, they are. I mean, they happen when the war is still going on. The war isn't legally over until August 1866. But even more important, right? If this war, from the Union perspective, and the Union did win, the Union says that this is a war not just about to preserve preserving the Union, but emancipating slavery, ending slavery. Lincoln has made that clear. Maybe the war didn't begin that way, but it became that way by the end. It is that way. Lincoln says it's that way in the second inaugural. If that is the case, why don't we have end dates in our heads for the war that line up with the end of slavery? That's a question that's there in the beginning of the book, and I want essentially hanging over us all, as any of us, including myself, think about the end of war. It hangs over me now still. As I said, I'm still going to use Appomattox as a marker for the end of war. But when Lee and Grant spoke in the parlor of McLean's house, they didn't talk about slavery. They didn't talk about emancipation. It didn't come up.
Yeah,
There
and
were there were armed black troops out there. There were regiments of U.S. Black troops out nearby that were part of the U.S. Army, and there were also many black civilians who had been impressed into Lee's army, who arguably were legally still enslaved, and that would end up going back to the South as enslaved people. So this is an open issue, and it's not
yeah.
discussed in the parlor of McLean's house.
Yeah, you're 100% right. And I had this thought when I was reading your book, and I'm curious to hear what you think about this. But I had this thought just thinking about what you were just talking about, like when was the date of when did the Civil War end? And, we think at Appomattox. And you wrote at one point, you had a line. Now, I understand, and you gave some more context that this was maybe a little bit more for practical purposes, but after Appomattox, the number of African American volunteers in the army goes from 1/5 to a half. So a half of am I remembering that correctly?
If I wrote it, then let's just say it's true. I
Okay,
don't have
well,
the numbers in front of me, but
well,
yeah,
I
I
I
would have
think
made, I
that
would have made sure to get it right. So I'm
a
not exactly
large
sure if that's right, because it also depends on what date you pick.
sure.
That probably would have been fairly late in the summer that moment came. But I'll let you finish your question, but just to explain to people what's going on, the Army's mustering out. The whole volunteer forces are mustering out very quickly. And it just happens for a variety of reasons. It's not all racism, but racism does end up playing a part. That white troops are mustering out at a higher rate than black troops. That's why, as you say, the fractions end up looking like you described them.
And a thought that came to my mind as often now where we when we think about history and how it's taught in our schools, and I think it's fair to say that right now maybe we're at a point in American history where we're starting to look back on whose history have we been teaching, and has that been predominantly the history of white people in this country. And I had a thought when I read that the war now after Appomattox, with such a large amount of African American volunteers, this is now a war where half of the troops fighting this battle against good against evil, I guess from the northern perspective, um, but half the troops are African American. So this no longer is just the history of white people fighting the war. Thinking about how we're taught our history, if it's just the history of white America that we learn in our schools, that's a generalization, but if that's predominantly the history, is it more convenient then for the war to end at Appomattox before these large numbers of African American troops are actually fighting the battles of the Civil War?
Yeah.
That's a thought I had. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about that.
Oh, I think about these things a lot. I think a lot of people think about these things. I also think our schools, our books have done a much better job right, than they did, let's say, 100 years ago at making the story of the Civil War not just a white story. In the book, I talk about how in 1965, 1965 is the centennial um, of the the Appomattox surrender, and there's a big uh, commemorative ceremony that happens at Appomattox, and the most famous Civil War historian of the day, Bruce Catton, gives a speech there, and that's 1965. And his speech is it's a white war. I mean, and this is about a perfect sort of reconciliation. And there's stories in my book, but you can find them elsewhere. That meanwhile, where's the black memory of the war? It exists certainly among African American communities, but a lot of black people in Appomattox itself were living rough lives and were being told this really isn't about you. So we've come a long way from 1965, I would say, and I think teachers have a lot to do with that, and they continue to do good work. So I'll say that first. By contrast, just if you go to 2015, which is the 150th anniversary, and again, there's a commemorative ceremony at Appomattox. And I write about this too. The National Park Service really did some pretty remarkable things, and it's also true if you go to Appomattox today and go to the park site. They've really made really great strides in doing the kind of work you're talking about, of making sure this isn't just a white American history, and because it isn't. Yeah, in terms of the fighting that's going on, it is tricky, right? Because these are not large pitched battles we're talking about. What it really is best described as is a kind of insurgency and anti-insurgency. That's the best way to think about what's happening in the South after, let's say, during the summer of 1865 and afterwards. And as we know from other wars, right, insurgencies don't translate easily into things you can mark on a timeline and on a map, right? They happen quickly, they happen simultaneously, they're short-lived. However, they can be very lethal, and there can be horrific violence in these insurgencies, and there was. And you're absolutely right that a lot of these insurgencies, on the anti-insurgencies, first of all, the insurgencies themselves are often white supremacist in nature. They're aimed at black civilians. And then the anti-insurgent troops are often black troops, not always. I don't want to overstate the presence of black troops in the army. I think we want to be careful. A lot of the black troops that are in the army in the end of the summer, they are expecting to muster out fairly quickly, and many do. And you are still then left with a regular army, the professional army. And that army does have certainly a black presence that's greater. It's going to get even bigger, and you're going to get the legendary Buffalo Soldiers, for example, uh, and that happened after the war. But in the anti-insurgency, let me just tell this story, which I think is emblematic. Black troops are really playing a key role at keeping the peace in these areas of the South, and at making sure that insurgencies either don't happen, or if they do happen, that they're put down. And a place where this is happening that's a good example might be, let's focus on Memphis, Tennessee. And Memphis is occupied by U.S. troops. And by the spring of 1866, the key regiments that occupy Memphis are black regiments. These are black U.S. troops. The white insurgents in Memphis know the day that the black troops are supposed to muster out in Memphis. And it is absolutely no coincidence that it is exactly the moment after the black troops in Memphis muster out, right? And they are no longer there, that you get the incredible insurgent violence that is called at the time the Memphis riots, but is properly called, and now historians tend to call, the Memphis Massacre, which is a massacre of black civilians in Memphis. And that just shows you, right, the need for force, and not just any kind of force, but this is a force where black Americans are playing a key role. Take that force away, and insurgency occurs. That's the nature of the war that's being fought now. It's a different kind of war, but for modern military historians, what I'm describing should sound very familiar, right? The transition from organized armies fighting into insurgency. That's a common story, and the story is not so different.
Well, I want to transition to current events now that we're at the end, and but I want to talk about just maybe Civil War in general. Um, my so when I got your book, and I was telling my wife, and this is actually a mischaracterization of your book, but I was like, oh yeah, I'm going to be interviewing an author who wrote a book about how Lincoln successfully negotiated a peaceful end to the Civil War. and my wife, such a political guy myself. My wife is maybe more political, and she's like, oh good. In times like these, we're going to need that.
Yeah.
And that it kind of got me thinking for this interview when it comes to civil wars in general. Let me just ask you, do you think America is inching closer to a second civil war?
Uh, well, I love the story you tell, which is that this is a story about Lincoln negotiating a peace. And I suppose I might be and will be accused of deceitfulness, right? By the cover uh, of the book has Lincoln on it, right? And it has the words Lincoln Peace. So you might very well think, and it says the struggle to end the Civil War. So, like, oh, yeah, it was tough to end the Civil War, but it ended and Lincoln was there, right? And so that's, I guess it is a little deceitful of me to draw people in and then say, guess what? Lincoln isn't going to live to see the end. And furthermore, the end doesn't come when you think it does. And furthermore, even more complicated, there's many endings. And okay. So I appreciate your willingness to interpret the cover that way, and I take full responsibility if I'm selling people a bad bill of goods.
No, no, not at
Uh,
all. Not a bad bill of goods
but
at all.
we should make clear what they're getting when they buy the book. But to your point about are we on the precipice of a civil war, which is a question, it is a perfectly reasonable question. It's a question I think a lot of people are asking themselves now. Um, I don't think if there is to be a civil war, I don't think it's going to look anything like the civil war that occurred in the 1860s. I really don't. Um, Obviously, we're a long period past that. But why do I say that? Well, I think that what it's harder to group people by section in the same way, right? You look at a map of politics in the last political election or the political election before that, and we talk about red states, blue states, and it looks like, oh, gee, look, there's a sectional divide. But it's very deceptive, as I'm sure you know, because pick one of those states, right, that's red, and it turns out, well, they're only red by a couple percentage points. Pick a state that's blue, and it just by a few points could have gone the other way. So the map that we have in our head, that electoral map, if you will, from whether it's 2024 or 2020, is deceptive in that way because we look at that and then we look at the map of the Civil War, which is a sectional map where we say, oh, those states were with the Confederacy, those states were with the Union. Oh dear, look at us now. It kind of looks like then. But it doesn't. It just isn't. There's absolute division and polarization. I don't deny that, but it doesn't map neatly onto sections the way that and that's going to just in a territorial way. It's going to make it basically impossible to have a war that looks like that war did. So what we get instead is something that I would call more like a cold civil war, uh, as opposed to a hot civil war. And what we had in the 1860s was a hot civil war. And so what we have now is a cold civil war, an idling civil war of ideologies, a civil war of language, a civil war of passion, of emotion, of a civil war of competing realities, really, absolutely competing realities. And by the way, I think if you go back to the American Civil War of the 1860s, that's a war of competing realities. I think there were very different visions of not only what America was about, but literally what was going on in America. You had groups of people who had very different ideas of what Lincoln's election meant. You had an entire group of people in the South who believed Lincoln's election meant we are now in a moment of tyranny, right? And a group of people who didn't believe that to be the case. Those are competing realities. We have the difference was, of course, that war became hot and hundreds of thousands of people died. What we have now is more of a Cold War. I don't mean to play down the significance of the war because Cold Wars can get hot, but if it gets hot, it looks different, right? And I don't know what that looks like. We got a little taste of what it looks like on January 6th, 2021, right? Excuse me, yeah, 2021, January 6th. A small taste there, and also look at some of the state capitals on the same day. So could that expand? I don't know. I taught my Civil War course this past fall at Brown University, and I felt it incumbent upon myself before I start teaching. I better go watch that movie called Civil War that came out in the
Oh,
spring.
God, that
Uh,
movie's terrifying.
what'd you say?
That movie was terrifying. Honestly,
Yeah,
to
and
me, one of the
I
scariest
think,
movies I've ever seen.
and so how can you not ask the question, right? Are we on the precipice of a civil war? I mean, I knew that that movie was coming a year before it came, and I thought, oh, this is probably going to be a flop, you know. And I was completely wrong. That movie did very well in the box office, and I watched it. I don't want to. I'm not a film critic. I mean, I certainly was. It was entertaining, but let's just remember what it was called. It was called Civil War, and and so like the idea that this is the abstract, you can't say that if you have a movie like this that's out there that you can now go and watch. Um, but that war depicted obviously is a very different war than the Civil War of the 1860s. We're not there yet, and I don't know if we will be there. I hope, of course, I hope, and I'm sure you hope, AJ, that we don't get there. But we are in something of a Cold War, and we know from experience in Cold Wars that they can go on for a long time, and they take on different shapes, forms, uh, adversaries, and they're wars of different sorts. They're not necessarily wars between armies, but between these different things I mentioned.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you for that answer. We'll put. Hopefully, that gives some of our listeners some peace. Last question here. Well, first, thank you so much for your time, and we honestly, all these topics, I could spend a whole episode. Texas itself, I could talk to you about for a very long time. But I'll wrap it up here. And my last question to you is, what do you hope that readers take away from this story?
I hope readers take away the idea that the American Civil War is always worthy of more study, and that it's always more complicated than you think. And if you take something that seems so obvious and so well known, we all know it, right? We all know that there was this ending at Appomattox, and you press on it, that it gets complicated, and that the complexity is not a problem. The complexity opens up better understandings that inform us not only about the past, but also about the present. And so that this journey that I took in researching and writing the book is a journey worth taking for anyone. And I guess in a larger sense, what's true, what I just said about the end of the Civil War is true for probably just about any moment in history. And since this is a podcast about military history, I'm sure it's true for any war. Press on a key moment of a war that you know, whether it's a famous battle, maybe it's the beginning of a war, maybe it's the end, and you will find a story there that's more complicated than is typically told. And in the complexity is not just interesting tidbits of knowledge, but I assure the listeners there are deeper meanings and deeper stories there with the kinds of larger questions that are intellectual questions, ideological questions, even moral questions. And this is what history can do for us. So I've given a very big answer at the end, but on the again, I take us back to the smaller answer, which is that we rethink endings of wars generally, but certainly that we rethink the ending of the Civil War and what it means simply to rethink the ending.
That's great. Well, Mike, if people want to stay in touch with your work, maybe they want to follow you on social media, how can they stay in touch with what you're doing?
Uh, I do have a website. I've got a website that's michaelvorenberg.com. It's kind of rough right now. It's in the process of getting better. It will never be fancy, I promise you that. But there are things there that talk about where I'm talking, where I'm giving talks, how to reach me, and things like that. And so you can reach me through that. There's email. I am on uh, Facebook. I guess I am on X and also on Blue Sky. Although I have to say, I have limited time in the day to devote to social
Sure.
media because
Good for
teach.
you.
I also teach courses here
That's a
for a
good thing.
living, so I exist there. So if it takes me a little while to respond, please don't take it personally. To any of your listeners out there, my own family is waiting for emails from me. So
No, I know. Believe me, I
so
know the
so
feeling.
I'll do the best I can. But I love talking to people. I love hearing
That's
from
great.
people, and especially if they read the book and have questions or want to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about it. If they want to tell me I got something wrong, definitely, I'm open. I'm all ears. So this has been great to talk to you,
Yeah.
and always enjoyable to talk to someone who's engaged with history like you are. So I
Oh,
appreciate
thank
it.
you. Well, Michael Vorenberg, Lincoln's Piece, The Struggle to End the American Civil War. Go buy a copy, go check it out from your library. What a relevant and interesting story you tell here. And Mike, thank you again for joining me on the show.
Thank you for having me, AJ. Really appreciate it.